Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Arkansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. There are medical cases that challenge everything we think we know about the human body. Cases that appear in dusty archives with clinical precision, yet leave more questions than answers. And then there are cases like Clara's, a woman who survived the impossible, only to disappear from history entirely. In 1867, in the war-ravaged state of Arkansas, a formerly enslaved woman contracted smallpox. The disease had already claimed thousands across the South. Physicians who examined her noted the progression with detached professionalism. The fever, the lesions spreading across her skin, the delirium that typically preceded death. They watched. They waited. They prepared to record another fatality in a year already saturated with loss. But Clara didn't die. Instead, as her body fought off one of the deadliest diseases known to the 19th century, something even more improbable occurred. Before she had fully recovered from smallpox, cholera arrived in her community. This second disease was, if anything, even more merciless than the first. Cholera killed quickly, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. It showed no mercy to the weak, the young, or those already compromised by illness. Clara contracted cholera while still bearing the scars of smallpox. The doctors called it a miracle. They documented her case with an obsessive attention to detail, recording symptoms, timelines, and physical observations with the cold precision of men studying a phenomenon rather than treating a patient. Yet for all their meticulous notes, they barely mentioned her name. Her age remains uncertain. Her background is reduced to a few dismissive words. Her voice, her own account of what happened to her body, her suffering, her survival, is entirely absent from the record. What remains is a medical curiosity preserved in fading ink, a case study of dual infection and inexplicable survival. But beneath the clinical language lies something far more disturbing. Because when you strip away the veneer of scientific observation, you're left with a deeply uncomfortable truth. This was not just a story of survival, it was a story of erasure. Clara lived through two epidemics that should have killed her. Doctors studied her, documented her, perhaps even intervened in ways they chose not to record. And then, just as mysteriously as she survived, she vanished from every official document. No death certificate, no census entry, no gravestone bearing her name. The miracle, it seems, was carefully documented. The woman was not. To understand how extraordinary and how unsettling Clara's case truly was, you have to understand the world she lived in. Arkansas in 1867 was a place where death was commonplace, where disease moved faster than help could arrive, and where certain lives were considered more expendable than others. The Civil War had ended 2 years earlier, but Arkansas bore the deep wounds of that conflict like a patient who had survived surgery only to develop a fatal infection. The state's infrastructure lay in ruins. Roads that had once connected towns and plantations were now rutted, impassable trails. Bridges had been burned, either by retreating Confederate forces or advancing Union troops, and no one had the resources to rebuild them. The railroads, which had never been extensive to begin with, were torn apart, rails ripped up for scrap metal, ties rotting in the southern heat. In this devastated landscape, disease found fertile ground. Smallpox had been present in North America for centuries, brought by European colonizers and periodically erupting in deadly waves. But the chaos of war had created perfect conditions for its resurgence. Armies had moved across the state, carrying infection from camp to camp, town to town. Refugees, both black and white, crowded into temporary settlements where sanitation was non-existent and medical care was a distant dream. Former plantations, now operating under the confused and often brutal transition from slavery to freedom, became breeding grounds for contagion. The disease announced itself with a fever that felt like your bones were trying to break through your skin. Then came the rash, small red spots that appeared first in the mouth and throat before spreading across the face and body. These spots transformed into raised bumps, then into pustules filled with thick, opaque fluid. In severe cases, the pustules merged together, creating vast, agonizing sheets of infection that covered entire limbs, the torso, the face. The pain was described as unbearable. The fever often reached levels that caused delirium and seizures. And then, if you were among the unlucky, you died. The mortality rate varied depending on the strain, but in communities without access to vaccination or proper isolation protocols, it could reach 30% or higher. Those who survived were often left permanently scarred, the pockmarks serving as a lifelong reminder of their brush with death. Many lost their sight when the infection spread to their eyes, but smallpox, deadly as it was, at least gave you time. It progressed over days, sometimes weeks. You could watch it coming. You could prepare in whatever limited ways were available. Cholera was different. Cholera killed with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. A person could wake up feeling fine, complain of stomach cramps by midday, and be dead before sunset. The disease attacked the intestines, causing massive, uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting that quickly led to severe dehydration. Victims described an overwhelming thirst that could never be satisfied, even as their bodies expelled every drop of fluid. Their skin took on a bluish tint, their eyes sank deep into their skulls, their voices became thin and reedy. In the medical literature of the time, doctors used the term cholera gravis for the most severe cases, patients who entered a state of collapse so complete that they resembled corpses even while still breathing. The disease spread through contaminated water, though this mechanism wasn't fully understood in 1867. Most doctors still subscribe to the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or noxious vapors rising from decomposing organic matter. This misunderstanding of cholera's true nature made containment nearly impossible. Wells were dug near outhouses. Rivers served as both water sources and sewage disposal systems. When cholera arrived in a community, it spread like wildfire, killing indiscriminately, but always hitting the poorest and most vulnerable the hardest. In Arkansas, that meant it hit the black community with devastating force. The end of slavery had not brought freedom in any meaningful sense for most formerly enslaved people. The promise of 40 acres and a mule never materialized for the vast majority. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a legal and economic limbo, no longer property, but not quite citizens either. Many remained on the same plantations where they had been enslaved, now working as sharecroppers under contracts that were barely distinguishable from bondage. Others crowded into towns, seeking work that didn't exist, living in shanties thrown together from scrap wood and canvas. These communities lacked even the most basic public health infrastructure. There were no doctors serving black patients, except in cases where white physicians took an interest, and that interest was often more scientific than humanitarian. There was no organized effort to vaccinate against smallpox, no clean water systems, no quarantine facilities. When disease struck, people died in numbers that were never accurately counted, in places that were never officially recorded. It was into this world, this landscape of devastation, disease, and institutional neglect, that Clara's story emerged. Or rather, it was in this world that her story was briefly noted, clinically observed, and then allowed to fade into obscurity. We know her name only because it appears in medical notes. Not patient notes in the modern sense, with intake forms and personal histories but observational records, the kind a naturalist might make when studying an unusual specimen. Clara, sometimes spelled as Claire in one set of documents, suggesting that even this basic identifier was subject to the carelessness of record-keepers who saw her as a subject rather than a person. No surname is given. This absence is not unusual. Many formerly enslaved people had not yet adopted or been granted surnames, and white administrators often didn't bother to record them even when they existed. Her age is listed variously as approximately 30 years in one document and between 25 and 35 in another. This 10-year span of uncertainty speaks volumes about the casual disregard with which she was observed. The doctors who studied her survival with such obsessive detail couldn't be bothered to determine her actual age. We don't know where she was born, though it was almost certainly in the South, likely in Arkansas or a neighboring state. We don't know who enslaved her, though the medical notes place her in the Arkansas River Valley region, where cotton plantations had been the dominant economic force before the war. We don't know if she had children, though at her age in that time and place, it would have been unusual if she did. We don't know if she could read or write. Almost certainly not, given that teaching enslaved people to read had been illegal in most southern states. What we do know comes from inference and context. The medical notes place her in what they describe as a freedmen's settlement near Little Rock. These settlements had sprung up across the South in the immediate aftermath of the war, as formerly enslaved people left plantations seeking safety, community, and the promise of a new life. The reality rarely matched the hope. These settlements were overcrowded, undersupplied, and often hostile territory, with former Confederates and poor whites viewing the inhabitants as threats to their economic and social order. In these settlements, women like Clara would have worked whatever jobs they could find. Laundry, cooking, field work, domestic service in white households. The work was grueling, the pay was minimal or non-existent, and there was no legal recourse when employers simply refused to pay what they had promised. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, was understaffed, underfunded, and by 1867 was already being systematically dismantled by President Andrew Johnson and his allies. Clara would have lived in a cabin, probably shared with others. It would have had a dirt floor, walls that admitted wind and rain, a roof that leaked. Heat would have come from a fire that also served for cooking. Water would have come from a well or river, carried by hand. Privacy would have been a luxury she had never known, either in slavery or in freedom. This was the woman who survived smallpox and cholera in the same year. This was the woman whose medical case fascinated doctors enough to document it in detail, yet whose life merited barely a footnote. The erasure was systematic. In an era when even poor white patients were typically identified by full name, age, occupation, and family status, Clara received none of these courtesies. The message was clear. Her survival was interesting, but her personhood was not. And yet, despite this erasure, fragments remain. Not in official documents or census records, but in the spaces between the clinical observations. The doctors noted that she was uncooperative at times during examination, a phrase that might simply mean she was in agony, or might mean she resisted being studied like a laboratory animal. They noted that she refused certain treatments, suggesting she maintained some degree of agency even in her most vulnerable state. They noted that other residents of the settlement avoided her company after she contracted cholera, a detail that reveals the social dimension of her suffering, the way disease transformed her from a community member into an object of fear. These small details, probably included without much thought by the physicians, are the closest we can come to hearing Clara's own voice. They suggest a woman who, even while fighting for her life, even while being observed and documented by men who saw her as a curiosity, maintained her humanity in whatever small ways were available to her. But to understand what happened to Clara, we need to follow the progression of her illness in detail. We need to enter the world of suffering that the clinical notes describe with such detachment, and imagine what it actually meant to live through it. The fever came first. In the medical notes, this moment is recorded simply. Patient presented with elevated temperature, approximately 103 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by complaints of severe headache and back pain. But fever in the 1860s was not the manageable discomfort we might experience today, treatable with over-the-counter medication and bed rest. This was fever without intervention, without understanding, without relief. Clara would have felt it as a fire consuming her from the inside. The headache would have been crushing, a pressure behind her eyes that made light unbearable. The back pain, a characteristic early symptom of smallpox, would have been deep and unrelenting, as if her spine were being twisted. She would have experienced chills despite the fever, her body shaking uncontrollably as it tried to regulate a temperature that had gone dangerously out of balance. For 2 or 3 days, these symptoms would have been indistinguishable from a dozen other illnesses. Influenza, perhaps, or typhoid, or any of the other fevers that regularly swept through crowded settlements. But then the rash appeared. The medical notes describe it with clinical precision. Small red spots first observed in the oral cavity and pharynx, followed within 24 hours by similar eruptions on the face and forearms. What they don't describe is what this felt like. The spots in her mouth and throat would have made swallowing agony. Each breath would have irritated the lesions, causing pain that radiated through her jaw and neck. When the rash spread to her face, it would have announced her condition to everyone around her, marking her as infectious, dangerous, untouchable. Smallpox rash follows a distinctive pattern. Unlike chickenpox, where spots appear in waves at different stages of development, smallpox pustules all progress at the same rate. By the 4th or 5th day of the rash, Clara's face and arms would have been covered in raised bumps, each one hard to the touch, each one exquisitely painful. The pustules were most concentrated where bone was closest to the surface, across the forehead and cheekbones, on the hands and feet. As they developed, they would have stretched the skin, creating a sensation that patients described as being stabbed by thousands of tiny needles. The doctors noted her case as discrete confluent, meaning the pustules, while numerous, remained separate from each other rather than merging into the horrifying sheets of infection seen in the most severe cases. This distinction, which probably meant very little to Clara as she lay in agony, was significant to the physicians. It meant her case, while serious, was not necessarily fatal. The mortality rate for discrete confluent smallpox was high but not absolute. She had a chance, but having a chance required survival not just of the disease but of the treatment, or rather the lack of it. In 1867, the primary medical response to smallpox was isolation. Patients were quarantined, supposedly to prevent spread, but in practice this often meant abandonment. Clara would have been moved away from others in the settlement, possibly to a separate structure or simply to an isolated area within a shared building. She would have been given water if someone was willing to risk getting close enough to provide it, and perhaps food, though the pain in her mouth and throat would have made eating nearly impossible. The medical notes indicate that physicians visited her regularly during this period, but their visits were for observation, not treatment. They recorded the progression of the pustules. They noted her temperature. They documented the development of secondary symptoms, the swelling of her face that made her features nearly unrecognizable, the hoarseness of her voice as lesions developed in her larynx, the inflammation of her eyes that threatened her vision. What they didn't do was provide meaningful medical intervention, because there wasn't any to provide. The germ theory of disease was still years away from general acceptance. Vaccination against smallpox existed. Edward Jenner had developed it decades earlier, but it was useless once infection had already occurred. The treatments that were available were at best useless and at worst actively harmful. Bloodletting, purging, the administration of various tonics and powders that had no actual effect on the viral infection ravaging her body. So Clara's survival depended entirely on her own immune system, on resources of strength and resilience that had been built over 30 years of surviving slavery and its aftermath. The pustules reached their peak around the 8th or 9th day, then slowly began to crust over. This process, which took another week or more, was almost as painful as the initial eruption. The crusts were thick, hard, and pulled at the skin as they formed. When they eventually fell off, they left behind the characteristic pockmarks, permanent scars that would mark her as a smallpox survivor for the rest of her life. The doctors noted with evident satisfaction that she was progressing toward recovery by the 3rd week of illness. Her fever had broken. The pustules were healing. She was able to take food and water again. In their notes, you can sense their relief, not because they had grown attached to their patient, but because her survival validated their observations, provided them with a complete case study from infection to recovery. But Clara's ordeal was far from over. Because even as she lay in her isolated space, still weak, still bearing the fresh scars of smallpox, still struggling to regain the weight and strength the disease had stolen from her, cholera was making its way up the Arkansas River. Cholera typically announced its presence in a community not with a single case, but with a cluster. One day everything seemed normal, and the next day 3, 5, 10 people were violently ill. This sudden onset created a panic that was almost as dangerous as the disease itself. People fled, carrying the infection with them to new communities. Others refused to leave their homes, terrified of the invisible threat that seemed to lurk in the very air. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, especially in poor communities where resources were already stretched to the breaking point. The medical notes don't record exactly when cholera reached Clara's settlement, but they do note when she contracted it. Approximately 5 weeks following the resolution of smallpox symptoms, the patient presented with acute gastrointestinal distress characteristic of cholera infection. 5 weeks. Clara had been recovering for barely more than a month when the second disease struck. Her body was still weakened from the first ordeal. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her skin was still tender where the smallpox pustules had been. And now, instead of being allowed to heal, she was facing a disease that killed faster and more brutally than smallpox ever did. Cholera begins with stomach cramps, mild at first, easy to dismiss as indigestion or the result of spoiled food. But these cramps intensify rapidly, becoming waves of pain that double you over. Then comes the diarrhea. This is not the ordinary diarrhea of common illness. This is profuse, watery, so voluminous that it seems impossible that a human body could contain so much fluid. The medical term is rice water stool because of its pale, cloudy appearance, but this clinical description fails to capture the horror of what it meant to experience it. Clara would have been losing quarts of fluid every hour. With each episode, and they came frequently, relentlessly, her body became more dehydrated. Her blood thickened. Her heart struggled to pump. Her extremities began to turn blue as circulation failed. Her eyes sank into her skull. Her voice, if she could still speak, would have become a thin whisper. The doctors noted all of this with their characteristic detachment. Patient exhibited severe dehydration, cyanosis of the extremities, weak and rapid pulse, temperature below normal range. What they were describing was a woman entering the final stages of cholera, the state of collapse from which few recovered. But here's where Clara's case becomes truly extraordinary and truly disturbing. Because unlike with smallpox, where the doctors had simply observed and recorded, with cholera they intervened. The notes indicate that she received aggressive fluid therapy, a treatment that, in 1867, was still highly experimental and controversial. The therapy involved forcing the patient to drink large quantities of water mixed with salt and other minerals, attempting to replace the fluids being lost through diarrhea and vomiting. This treatment was based on work done by British physicians during cholera outbreaks in India, but it had not been widely adopted in the United States. The medical establishment was divided on its effectiveness, and many doctors considered it useless or even dangerous. So why was it tried with Clara? The notes don't say. They don't explain the decision-making process, don't record any discussion of consent or alternatives. Clara, barely conscious, certainly wasn't in a position to agree or refuse. Someone made the decision to treat her aggressively, to try an experimental therapy on a black woman who had no legal recourse, no family advocates, no voice in her own medical care. And it worked. Or at least something worked. The notes record that after 3 days of intensive fluid replacement, Clara's condition began to stabilize. The diarrhea decreased in frequency. Her pulse strengthened. Color began to return to her skin. By the 5th day, she was able to sit up. By the 7th, she was taking solid food. The doctors were astonished. Cholera, especially when it reached the advanced stage Clara had experienced, was almost uniformly fatal. The mortality rate in similar cases was estimated at 70 to 80% or higher. And yet here was a woman who had not only survived, but who was recovering with a speed that seemed to defy medical logic. But there's another, darker possibility that the notes hint at without ever directly addressing. What if Clara had been deliberately exposed to cholera? What if the fluid therapy was not a desperate attempt to save a dying patient, but part of a planned observation of how the disease progressed and how the treatment worked? This possibility sounds like something from a horror story, but it's not as far-fetched as we might wish. The 1860s were a period when medical ethics, particularly regarding black patients, were virtually non-existent. The experiments conducted by J. Marion Sims on enslaved women, performed without anesthesia, were considered groundbreaking research rather than torture. The Tuskegee syphilis study, though it wouldn't begin until the 1930s, had its roots in this earlier period's assumptions about black bodies as medical resources to be studied rather than people to be treated. The notes never explicitly state that Clara was a research subject, but they also never explain why a poor black woman in a freedmen's settlement received cutting-edge medical treatment that was being denied to other cholera patients. They never explain why the doctors were so conveniently present to document every stage of both illnesses. They never explain what happened to the detailed records they clearly kept, why they survive only in fragments, with key information redacted or missing. What we're left with is a deeply unsettling picture. A woman who survived 2 deadly diseases, received unprecedented medical attention, and then vanished from all records as if she had never existed. To understand what really happened to Clara, we need to understand the men who documented her case. We need to enter their world, the world of American medicine in the Reconstruction South, a world where scientific curiosity often overrode ethical concerns, and where certain lives were considered more expendable than others. The primary physician whose name appears on the surviving notes was Dr. Amos Weaver, a Massachusetts-born surgeon who had served with Union forces during the war and remained in Arkansas afterward. Weaver was educated at Harvard Medical School, trained in an era when American medicine was trying to establish itself as a legitimate science, rather than a collection of folk remedies and superstitions. But being trained at Harvard didn't mean Weaver understood disease in the way we do today. He would have graduated believing in the miasma theory, in the importance of balancing bodily humors, in the therapeutic value of bloodletting. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that microorganisms cause infection, was being developed by Louis Pasteur and others during this exact period, but it hadn't yet penetrated medical education in any meaningful way. What Weaver did have was curiosity. His notes reveal a mind that wanted to understand why Clara survived, that recognized her case as extraordinary, that saw an opportunity to contribute to medical knowledge. This curiosity is admirable in the abstract. But divorced from empathy, divorced from any recognition of Clara as a full human being deserving of dignity and autonomy, this curiosity becomes something else entirely. The notes reveal this lack of empathy in subtle ways. Clara is never Mrs. or Miss, just the patient or the subject, or occasionally the colored woman. Her symptoms are described in exhaustive detail, but her fear, her pain, her subjective experience of illness are mentioned only when they interfere with observation. When she's described as uncooperative, there's no consideration of why a woman who had just survived smallpox might be reluctant to submit to more medical examination, might want to be left alone to heal in peace. Weaver was not alone in his observations. The notes reference consultations with other physicians, though most of these men are not named. One who is named is Dr. Thomas Hardwick, a local Arkansas doctor who had practiced in the area since before the war. Hardwick's contributions to the notes are less detailed than Weaver's, but they reveal a different perspective, that of a Southern physician accustomed to treating enslaved patients, accustomed to viewing black bodies as fundamentally different from white ones. There was a common belief among Southern physicians that black people were more susceptible to certain diseases and more resistant to others. These beliefs were used to justify everything from the continuation of slavery, claiming that black people couldn't survive in colder climates and therefore needed the protection of Southern masters, to medical neglect, claiming that black people didn't feel pain as intensely as white people. Hardwick's notes reflect these beliefs, describing Clara's constitution as robust despite her race, and expressing surprise at her survival in terms that make it clear he had expected her to die simply because she was black. The collaboration between Weaver and Hardwick, between the Northern-trained physician and the Southern practitioner, represents the complexity of Reconstruction-era medicine. They came from different backgrounds, held different political views, probably disagreed on fundamental questions about race and society. But they were united in their view of Clara as a fascinating case study rather than a person. And then there's the question of the fluid therapy. The decision to treat Clara's cholera aggressively, using a method that was still experimental, had to come from somewhere. The notes indicate that the treatment was initiated under the supervision of Dr. Weaver, but they don't explain his reasoning. Was he trying to save her life out of medical duty? Or was he conducting an experiment, using Clara's cholera infection as an opportunity to test whether fluid replacement therapy could work under field conditions? The timing is suspicious. Fluid replacement therapy for cholera was being discussed in medical journals during this exact period. Papers were being published arguing for and against the approach. A physician like Weaver, educated at a prestigious institution, would have been aware of these debates. He would have understood that successfully treating a cholera patient using this method would be publishable, would bring him recognition, might advance his career. But to test the treatment, you needed a patient. And not just any patient. You needed someone who wouldn't or couldn't object, someone whose survival or death wouldn't cause too much social upheaval, someone whose case you could document in detail without interference from family or legal authorities. You needed someone like Clara. The notes never confirm this interpretation. They maintain the facade of objective clinical observation throughout, but the facade has cracks. There are references to repeated observations during Clara's smallpox infection, suggesting a level of access and monitoring that goes beyond what would be typical for a patient in a freedmen's settlement. There are detailed measurements of fluid input and output during the cholera episode, the kind of precise data collection that requires constant presence and intervention. There are references to Clara being maintained in isolation for purposes of observation, well after she had recovered from both diseases, long after any quarantine period would typically end. These fragments paint a picture of a woman who was not simply a patient being treated, but a subject being studied. And once you see the case through that lens, Clara's disappearance from the records becomes even more troubling. While the doctors recorded their observations in clinical language, the community around Clara was developing its own narrative, one based not on medical science but on fear, superstition, and the deep traumas of slavery that still shaped every aspect of life in the South. To the other residents of the freedmen's settlement, Clara's survival would have seemed impossible. Everyone knew that smallpox killed. Everyone had seen cholera sweep through communities, leaving bodies in its wake. For one woman to survive both in the same year, while still recovering from the first illness when the second struck, this wasn't just improbable. It was unnatural. The medical notes provide our only written evidence of the community's response, and even this evidence is filtered through the perspective of white physicians who had no real understanding of Black Southern culture. But still, fragments emerge. There are references to Clara being avoided by other residents after her recovery from cholera. This isolation was described by the doctors as a reasonable quarantine measure, but the language suggests something deeper. People weren't just keeping their distance for fear of infection. They were afraid of her. In one particularly telling note, Dr. Hardwick records that the colored population has developed various superstitious explanations for the patient's survival, including claims of divine intervention and rumors of unnatural practices. He dismisses these superstitions as ignorance, but what if they were something else? What if the community sensed that something wrong had happened, even if they couldn't articulate it in medical terms? The concept of divine intervention makes sense in a community where religion was one of the few sources of comfort and power available to the formerly enslaved. If God had chosen to save Clara, that was a miracle, a sign of hope in a hopeless time. But miracles were also frightening in their power, and people touched by miracles often found themselves set apart, viewed with a mixture of awe and fear. The rumors of unnatural practices are harder to interpret. Were people suggesting that Clara had made some kind of bargain, that she had engaged in hoodoo or conjuring? These practices, rooted in African spiritual traditions and adapted to the circumstances of slavery, were widespread in the Black South. They represented a form of power that existed outside white control, a way of asserting agency in a world that denied agency at every turn. Or were the rumors suggesting something else, that the white doctors had done something unnatural to Clara? That her survival was not a miracle but the result of experimentation, of treatments that violated the natural order? We can't know for certain, because the voices of Clara's community were never recorded. The doctors noted the existence of rumors but made no effort to understand them. No one interviewed the other residents of the settlement. No one asked them what they had seen, what they feared, what they believed had happened. What we do know is that Clara's isolation became permanent. Even after she had fully recovered from both diseases, even after any reasonable quarantine period had ended, She was not reintegrated into the community. The notes indicate that she remained in separate quarters and that her interactions with other residents were minimal. This isolation might have been enforced by the doctors who wanted to continue observing her, or it might have been self-imposed, Clara choosing to remain apart rather than face the fear and suspicion of her neighbors. Or it might have been imposed by the community itself, people who had decided that Clara was marked, changed, no longer fully one of them. There's another possibility, one that the fragmentary records hint at but never confirm. What if Clara's isolation wasn't just social, but physical? What if she was moved from the freedmen's settlement entirely, taken to another location where the doctors could observe her without interference? This possibility is supported by a gap in the records. For several months following her recovery from cholera, there are no medical notes, no mentions of Clara at all in any surviving documents. Then, almost 6 months later, there's a single brief entry in what appears to be a different set of records, possibly from a different location. Former smallpox and cholera patient continues in good health. No recurrence of symptoms. Immunity appears complete. Immunity. This is the first time the word appears in connection with Clara's case. It suggests a shift in how the doctors were thinking about her survival, not just as a lucky escape, but as something that could be studied, understood, potentially replicated. In the 1860s, the concept of immunity was still poorly understood. Vaccination had demonstrated that exposure to a mild form of disease could protect against more severe illness, but the mechanism behind this protection was mysterious. The idea that surviving one disease might provide lasting protection was accepted for smallpox and a few other illnesses, but cholera was different. People could and did contract cholera multiple times. There was no known lasting immunity. Yet here was Clara, not only having survived cholera, but apparently protected against reinfection even as the disease continued to circulate in Arkansas. To physicians like Weaver, who were trying to establish medicine as a legitimate science, Clara's case represented a potential breakthrough. If they could understand why she had survived, why she appeared immune, they might unlock secrets that could save thousands of lives. But to unlock those secrets, they needed Clara to remain available for study. They needed her isolated from variables, from other potential exposures, from anything that might complicate their observations. They needed her to be more specimen than person. And so Clara disappeared from community view, existing only in the fragmentary medical records of physicians who saw her as the key to a scientific puzzle, rather than as a woman who had already suffered more than any person should have to endure. By late 1867, Clara had become something unprecedented in the medical literature of the time. A documented case of survival from two separate epidemic diseases contracted in rapid succession. The doctors watching her, primarily Weaver, but now including others who had become interested in the case, faced a profound puzzle. By every measure they understood, she should have been dead. The medical thinking of the era provided no adequate explanation for her survival. The miasma theory couldn't account for why the same bad air that had killed dozens of others in the settlement had failed to kill Clara. The balance of humors theory couldn't explain why her constitution, supposedly weakened by smallpox, had somehow grown strong enough to fight off cholera. Even the nascent understanding of immunity didn't fit neatly with what had happened. In their notes, the doctors began to use the word miracle with increasing frequency, but not in the religious sense that Clara's community might have used it. To them, miracle meant phenomenon not yet explained by science. It was a placeholder, an admission of ignorance dressed up as wonder. But some of the notes suggest they were beginning to develop theories, crude and incorrect as they might have been. Weaver wrote extensively about Clara's constitutional vigor, attempting to identify physical characteristics that might explain her resilience. He noted that she was of medium height and robust build, though he also noted that she had lost considerable weight during both illnesses. He conducted what he called capacity tests, measuring her lung function and heart rate, looking for evidence of superior physical conditioning. These examinations, described in the notes with clinical detachment, must have been deeply invasive and humiliating for Clara. She was poked, measured, made to perform physical tasks while the doctors recorded her responses. And through it all, there's no indication that anyone asked her permission, explained what they were doing, or considered her dignity as a person. Other theories focused on her medical history. Had she been exposed to mild forms of these diseases earlier in life, building immunity without anyone realizing it? This was possible, even likely for smallpox, vaccination using cowpox, or even deliberate infection with mild smallpox strains had been practiced sporadically. But for cholera, this explanation made less sense. The disease didn't work that way. Hardwick, the Southern physician, advanced what might be the most disturbing theory of all. He suggested that Clara's racial characteristics might account for her survival, arguing that black people possessed natural immunities that white people lacked. This theory was not based on any scientific evidence. It was pure speculation rooted in the racist assumptions of the era. But it gained traction in some medical circles, becoming part of a broader pseudoscientific discourse about racial difference that would persist for decades. The irony is bitter. For centuries, white physicians and scientists had argued that black people were inferior, more susceptible to disease, less deserving of medical care. But when faced with a case that challenged their expectations, when confronted with black survival that defied explanation, they didn't abandon their racist frameworks. They simply inverted them, turning Clara's survival into evidence of difference rather than evidence of their own ignorance. None of these theories came close to the truth, of course. We now know that immunity to cholera does develop after infection, though it's not absolute and it wanes over time. We know that smallpox survival depends on factors like the viral strain, the patient's overall health, and yes, prior exposure to related viruses. We know that Clara's survival, while remarkable, was not miraculous. It was the result of a complex interaction between pathogen and immune system, influenced by factors the doctors of 1867 had no way of understanding. But here's what makes Clara's case truly extraordinary and truly troubling: the aggressive medical intervention she received during her cholera infection. Because while we can't know for certain whether that intervention saved her life, we can say with confidence that it was unusual, possibly unique among cholera patients in Arkansas at that time. The fluid replacement therapy that Weaver administered was labor-intensive, requiring constant monitoring and forced fluid intake even when the patient was semi-conscious and unable to swallow easily. It was expensive in terms of time and resources, and in 1867, it was still unproven. So why did Clara receive this treatment when other cholera patients in the same settlement in the same time period were left to die with only minimal care? The notes don't provide a clear answer, but they do provide clues. There are references to ongoing observation of disease progression and opportunity to test therapeutic interventions under controlled conditions. There are mentions of Clara being maintained in isolation to minimize confounding variables. This is not the language of emergency medical treatment. This is the language of a controlled experiment. It's possible that Weaver genuinely wanted to save Clara's life, that he saw her as a patient who had already survived one deadly disease and deserved every chance to survive a second. But it's equally possible, perhaps more likely, given the complete absence of consent discussions in the notes, that he saw her as an opportunity, a chance to test a controversial treatment on a patient who had no legal rights, no family to object, no voice that anyone would listen to. If the treatment worked, Weaver would have evidence to support the fluid replacement approach, evidence that could be published, that could advance medical knowledge in his career. If it failed, well, cholera was almost always fatal anyway. The death of one more black woman in a freedmen's settlement would hardly be noticed. This is the dark heart of Clara's miracle. Her survival might not have been despite medical intervention, but because of it, intervention she may never have consented to, intervention that might have been motivated more by scientific curiosity than by humanitarian concern. And when she did survive, when she proved the efficacy of the treatment beyond any doubt, what happened? Was she celebrated? Was her case published in medical journals, her contribution to medical knowledge acknowledged? Was she compensated, thanked, even simply informed about what had been done to her? No, she disappeared. The last reliable mention of Clara in the medical notes is dated February 1868, approximately 4 months after her recovery from cholera. The entry is brief. Patient continues in good health. No symptoms of recurrence. Will continue periodic observation. After that, nothing. She vanishes from the documentary record as completely as if she had never existed. There is no death certificate for Clara, at least none that survives in Arkansas state records. There is no grave marker, no obituary, no mention in local newspapers. She doesn't appear in the 1870 census, despite the fact that census takers made extensive efforts to count the formerly enslaved population as part of establishing their new status as citizens and potential voters. This absence is not unusual in itself. Record-keeping for black Southerners in this period was notoriously incomplete. Many people slipped through the bureaucratic cracks, living and dying without leaving any official trace. But Clara's absence is different because we know she existed. We have medical records proving she was alive in 1868. And then she's simply gone. The most mundane explanation is that she died shortly after the last medical note, and her death was never properly recorded. This happened frequently. If she died outside of medical supervision, if her body was simply buried by community members without notification of authorities, there would be no official record. The doctors who had been so obsessed with documenting her survival apparently felt no obligation to document her death. But there are reasons to doubt this explanation. If Clara had died in early 1868, it's strange that there's no final medical note recording it. Weaver and Hardwick had been meticulous in their documentation up to that point. It seems unlikely they would suddenly lose interest at precisely the moment when their patient died, especially when that death would represent important data for their case study. Another possibility is that Clara left Arkansas. Perhaps she joined the thousands of formerly enslaved people who migrated west or north in the years immediately following the war, seeking better opportunities or simply fleeing the violence and oppression of the South. If she traveled to another state and died there, that would explain the absence of Arkansas records. But this explanation also has problems. The medical notes from late 1867 describe Clara as being maintained under observation, language that suggests she was not free to leave. And if she had successfully departed, you would expect some mention of it in the final notes, a statement that the patient had ended treatment, had declined further observation, had left the area. Instead, there's just silence. A third possibility is more disturbing, that Clara's disappearance was deliberate, that she was moved to another location, perhaps a medical facility or institution, where she could be studied further without the complications of community awareness or interference, and that the records of what happened to her in that location were either never made public or were destroyed. This might sound like conspiracy theory, but it fits with what we know about medical experimentation on Black patients in this era. The line between treatment and experimentation was blurry at best, and consent was not considered necessary when the subjects were Black, poor, or institutionalized. Patients could be held against their will in the name of medical observation. They could be subjected to procedures and experiments without their knowledge or permission. If Clara had indeed demonstrated immunity to reinfection, if she represented a living example of how the body could fight off epidemic disease, she would have been valuable to researchers. Too valuable to simply let walk away. Too valuable to risk losing track of. The fragmentary nature of the surviving records supports this interpretation. The notes we have appear to be copies or excerpts from more comprehensive documentation. There are references to additional observations recorded separately and see attached case notes. But these additional materials are not present in the archive. Either they were never included when the documents were preserved, or they were deliberately removed. There's also the question of who preserved these records at all. Medical notes from this period were not typically archived unless they were considered significant enough to warrant publication or further study. The fact that Clara's case notes survive, even in fragmentary form, suggests someone thought they were important. But if they were important enough to preserve, why weren't they published? Why didn't Weaver write up the case for a medical journal, as he surely would have done if this were simply an interesting medical anomaly he had witnessed? The most likely explanation is that publication was considered, but rejected, not because the case wasn't significant, but because publishing it would have raised uncomfortable questions. Questions about consent, about the ethics of the treatment Clara received, about what exactly had been done to this Black woman in the name of medical science. In the decades following Clara's disappearance, there were a few scattered references to an unnamed smallpox and cholera survivor in Arkansas medical circles. These references are always vague, never providing names or specific details. It's possible these were referring to Clara, or it's possible they were referring to other cases that have been similarly lost to history. Either way, the pattern is clear. When Black patients provided useful medical information, that information was preserved and circulated. But the patients themselves, their names and stories and eventual fates, were considered irrelevant. Clara survived smallpox. She survived cholera. She survived medical experimentation, if that's what it was. But she did not survive history. Her existence was reduced to a series of clinical observations. Her voice was never heard, and her final chapter was left unwritten. More than 150 years after Clara's documented survival of 2 epidemic diseases, we are left with questions that will never be fully answered. The documentary record is too incomplete, too biased, too carefully curated to provide the truth we seek. But in the absences and silences, in the things the medical notes don't say, we can begin to understand not just what happened to one woman, but what happened to countless others whose stories were never recorded at all. The central mystery, how Clara survived, has a medical answer that the doctors of 1867 couldn't have known. She survived smallpox because her immune system, for whatever combination of genetic and environmental reasons, was able to mount an effective response to the virus. She survived cholera because she received aggressive medical intervention at a time when most patients received none, and because that intervention, crude as it was, provided her body with enough support to fight off the infection. But this medical answer, while accurate, is also incomplete, because it doesn't address the deeper questions. Why did Clara receive that intervention when others didn't? What was done to her in the name of medical observation? What did she experience, think, feel during those months of illness and recovery? What happened to her after the medical notes ended? These questions have no clear answers, but they have implications that reach far beyond one woman's story. Clara's case exists in a historical context where black bodies were routinely exploited for medical advancement. The experiments of J. Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, who operated on enslaved women without anesthesia. The theft of Henrietta Lacks cells, taken without consent, and used for decades of medical research while her family remained in poverty. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where black men with syphilis were denied treatment so doctors could observe the disease's natural progression. These are the famous cases, the ones that eventually scandalized the medical establishment enough to prompt reform. But for every famous case, there were dozens or hundreds that remain unknown. Cases like Clara's, where the evidence is fragmentary, where the exploitation was never acknowledged, where the patient simply disappeared. The medical establishment has made significant progress in addressing these historical wrongs. Modern medical ethics, informed by hard lessons learned from past abuses, requires informed consent, mandates respect for patient autonomy, and recognizes the fundamental humanity of every patient regardless of race, class, or circumstance. But acknowledging this progress doesn't erase the past. It doesn't restore the voices that were silenced or the lives that were reduced to case notes. What Clara's story reveals is not just historical injustice, but historical erasure. She existed, she suffered, she survived, and then she was written out of history, her existence preserved only in the clinical observations of men who saw her as a subject rather than a person. Even her survival, her remarkable, possibly unprecedented survival of two deadly diseases, was framed not as her achievement but as a medical mystery, a puzzle for doctors to solve. And here's what might be most disturbing. We can't even be certain that her survival was purely natural. The aggressive medical intervention she received, the experimental treatment, the careful monitoring, all of this raises the possibility that what the doctors called a miracle was actually their own creation. That they saved Clara's life not out of compassion, but to validate their theories and advance their careers. That her survival, far from being a testament to her strength, was the result of medical experimentation that was never disclosed and could never be questioned. We don't know where Clara is buried, if she's buried at all. We don't know if she lived years beyond 1868 or died shortly after the last medical note. We don't know if she ever understood what had been done to her, if she ever told her story to anyone who wrote it down, if she ever found peace. What we do know is this. In 1867 in Arkansas, a woman whose name we barely know survived two of the deadliest diseases of the 19th century. Doctors documented her survival with obsessive attention to detail, preserving observations that have survived more than a century. But they didn't preserve her. They didn't honor her humanity, didn't record her voice, didn't ensure that future generations would remember her as a person rather than a case study. The miracle, they said, was her survival, but maybe the real miracle would have been if someone had thought to ask Clara her own story, if someone had recorded not just her symptoms but her words. If someone had cared enough to document not just how she lived through smallpox and cholera, but how she lived afterward, what became of the woman who endured so much? In the end, Clara's case tells us less about 19th century medicine than about whose lives were considered worth documenting, whose suffering was considered worth preventing, whose stories were considered worth preserving. The medical notes survived because they were considered valuable. Clara didn't survive in the historical record because she was. And somewhere, in an unmarked grave or a forgotten plot, lies a woman who beat impossible odds, who endured unimaginable suffering, who might have been saved or might have been experimented on, and who disappeared from history as completely as if she had never existed at all. The doctors called it a miracle, but for Clara, survival might have been only the beginning of a different kind of ordeal, one that left no scars visible to the historical record, one that ended in a silence so complete that even her death went unrecorded. That silence is her legacy, and it echoes with the voices of thousands of others like her, patients whose cases advanced medical knowledge while their own stories were deemed irrelevant, people who were documented but never truly seen.